You already had your breakfast. Well, good morning. I'm trying to do a morning sermon real fast because I was busy yesterday and didn't get a chance to record it on Sunday, so I'm trying to do it before work today. I was busy yesterday because I'm part of a book club that is meeting to discuss the works of MacDonald and the works of MacDonald and C.S. Lewis and friends and anything that inspired or is associated with them. But when we met at a bakery, they gave us a bunch of cinnamon rolls when they were closing, and so I get a lovely breakfast today. And maybe Bob does too. But today's Unspoken sermon by George MacDonald is titled Love Thy Neighbor. And as you might expect, it's coming from a verse in Matthew 22:39 that says, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." And he jumps right in and starts referencing other verses in the Bible that say similar things. Oh, hello. He says, "The same words are twice quoted by St. Paul and once by St. James, always in a similar mode. Love they represent as the fulfilling of the law." Is the converse true then? Is the fulfilling of the law love? And then he answers, "No, verily. If a man keeps the law, I know he is a lover of his neighbor. But he is not a lover because he keeps the law. He keeps the law because he is a lover. No heart will be content with the law for love. The law cannot fulfill love." So he's saying that love is an altogether higher thing than the law, and if you are at once able to fulfill love, then you are therefore also fulfilling the law. But it's not the other way around. Love isn't fulfilled by just doing the law. And so if I say I love my neighbor just because I'm treating him right, then that's not exactly accurate. I'm not actually loving him. And would the neighbor be able to feel the love if I'm just checking the boxes that I'm required to be like a kind person? No heart will be content with the law for love. Here he says, "Love is law because it is infinitely more than law." So why even have the law then if love is what we actually need to do to fulfill it? MacDonald says it is to show us our need for grace and therefore for God. He says, "Of what use then is the law? To lead us to Christ, the truth, to awaken in our minds a sense of what our deepest nature, the presence, namely, of God in us, requires of us, to let us know, in part by failure, that the purest effort of will of which we are capable cannot lift us up even to the abstaining from wrong to our neighbor. The law comes to make us long for the needful grace, that is, for the divine condition in which love is all, for God is love." And he continues on the next page saying that if we at once begin to fulfill the spirit of the law towards our neighbors, then we'll find that we actually start loving our neighbors. He says, "Suppose a man of the company had put the same question to our Lord that we have been considering, had said, 'But I may keep the law and yet not love my neighbor,' would not he have returned, 'Keep thou the law thus, not in the letter, but in the spirit, that is, in the truth of action, and thou wilt soon find, O Jew, that thou lovest thy Samaritan.' And yet, when thoughts and questions arise in our minds, he desires that we should follow them. He will not check us with a word of heavenly wisdom scornfully uttered. He knows that not even his words will apply to every question of the willing soul. And we know that his Spirit will reply. When we want to know more, that more will be there for us." So when we ask silly questions like, well, who exactly is my neighbor so I can know exactly who I have to be responsible for? Or questions like, can I do the law towards my neighbor and have that count as love? MacDonald responds by giving a similar answer that Lewis gave when he was talking about acting like you love someone first, and you'll find that you will eventually begin to love them. And then he adds on a little tidbit harkening back to his earlier sermon, saying that we shouldn't shy away from asking questions of God, even if they're kind of silly sounding like these, because God will not take it ill if we ask questions of him. And when we want to know more, that more will be given to us. He goes on to talk about how the love that can bind us all together in the church and beyond comes from God, of course. And he describes the members of the church as atoms in the body as opposed to organs like in the Bible. I think that's a healthy reminder that we're all very insignificant parts of this massive structure, as opposed to like, well, I'm the lungs, so I'm pretty important, guys. I'm just an atom in the lungs, and so I will fulfill my part still, but that part is infinitesimal compared to the whole. So I suppose it's actually kind of comforting and takes the pressure off a little bit. He says, "In God alone can man meet man. When the mind of Christ, the life of the head, courses through that atom which the man is of the slowly revivifying body, when he is alive too, then the love of the brothers is there as a conscious life. From Christ, through the neighbors, comes the life that makes him a part of the body." Pardon the scene change, you can see we're inside now. That's because it just got way too loud outside, and I decided to just go on to work. And now I'm back actually 2 days later to see where we left off and see if we can finish off this sermon. Alright, I think we were down here where MacDonald is saying that it is from Christ and through the neighbors that comes the life that makes them part of the body. And he describes the individuals as atoms. And he continues on this page by saying that once we begin to try to love people, we'll find that some people are easy for us to love and that it kind of happens naturally. But that others are, as he describes them, dull and uninteresting to us, and that we have to find ways to love them anyway. And this, of course, reminded me of Lewis's The Four Loves, and affection, which can draw us near to those who are dislike us, or as Lewis says, can help us learn to appreciate a different brand of good, I think is what he calls it, where you can just be around somebody for a long time, and though they have nothing in common with you, you'll begin to appreciate them just as a fixture of your life, essentially. And then they can show you things that are good that you may not have otherwise accepted as such. But MacDonald hasn't made it that far yet. He's still talking about us having difficulty loving those who are different than us. And this whole next page is actually an internal debate of somebody trying to figure out how he is supposed to love somebody else who's separate from him. And he has a whole bunch of dialogue going back and forth, but I'll just read this last part where he says, "But I cannot get into his consciousness, nor he into mine. I feel myself. I do not feel him. My life flows through my veins, not through his. The world shines into my consciousness, and I am not conscious of his consciousness. I wish I could love him, but I do not see why. I am an individual. He is an individual. Myself must be closer to me than he can be. Two bodies keep me apart from his self. I am isolated with myself." And MacDonald is going to say that it is precisely that otherness that allows us to love them. He says, "Now here lies the mistake at last. He falsely judges the individuality a separation. On the contrary, it is the sole possibility and very bond of love. Otherness is the essential ground of affection." He goes on to say you can't reason into love. If you don't love someone naturally, then you can't make an argument to love them. But he also says that if at once you can begin to love them, then suddenly the reasons will be there and you'll see why you do. Perhaps things that would have irritated you when you didn't love them and therefore kept you from loving them. If you can get over that barrier and actually just love them, then those irritations will actually be a reason that you do love them. Those differences that might have been grating before now are perhaps instructive. So it's difficult to understand why we should love somebody. But he says, when will once begins to aspire, it will soon find that action must precede feeling. So he says, if you don't love somebody naturally, just act like you do, like we talked about earlier, and then the feelings will come. And he says that the whole system of divine education as regards the relation of man and man has for its end that a man should love his neighbor as himself. So that's the goal. And he compares that even to right and wrong and how kind of natural a feeling that is. But he has an imagined objector say that, okay, sure, there is a sense of universal morality that everyone can kind of agree upon, though it looks different in different cultures. But what we don't have is a universal sense of like loving everybody. Like that is not present, and if it is present, it's not very strong. The objector says, The loving of one's neighbor is not seen to be a primary truth. So far from it, that far the greater number of those who hope for an eternity of blessedness through him who taught it, do not really believe it to be a truth. Believe, on the contrary, that the paramount obligation is to take care of one's self, at much risk of forgetting one's neighbor. So here the objector is actually using for his argument the fact that many people who have faith in God prefer to assert their own rights and desires above those of their neighbors. So of course, the loving thy neighbor law then is something that is not as universally accepted as the universal morality of right and wrong. And against this point, MacDonald has an interesting argument. He just says that humanity has not spiritually evolved far enough to get to the point where we have a universal sense of loving one's neighbor. He says, but the human race generally has got as far as the recognition of right and wrong, and therefore most men are born capable of making the distinction. The race has not yet lived long enough for its latest offspring to be born with the perception of the truth of love to the neighbor. It is to be seen by the present individual only after a long reception of and submission to the education of life. The whole constitution of human society exists for the express end, I say, of teaching the two truths by which man lives, love to God and love to man. And as an aside on paternal love, he says that we come into the world as we do to look up to the love over us, and see in it a symbol, poor and weak, yet the best we can have or receive of the divine love. And thousands more would find it easy to love God if they had not such miserable types of him in the self-seeking, impulse-driven, purposeless, faithless beings who are all they have for father and mother. But love we must, and he says that our love should ever be spreading outwards and getting wider, because if it doesn't, then it will die. So one thing MacDonald says can help us learn to spread our love farther is realizing that while our family is close to us because of blood, everybody that we meet is close to us because of our relation to God. They are our spiritual brothers and sisters, including our family, of course. But he says, the love that enlarges not its borders, that is not ever spreading and including and deepening, will contract, shrivel, decay, die. I have had the sons of my mother, that I may learn the universal brotherhood. For there is a bond between me and the most wretched liar that ever died for the murder he would not even confess, closer infinitely than that which springs only from having one father and mother. That we are the sons and the daughters of God, born from his heart, is a bond closer than all other bonds in one. No man ever loved his own child aright who did not love him for his humanity, for his divinity, to the utter forgetting of his origin from himself. And he keeps iterating that this is everybody, not just people who we feel close to. He says, a man must not choose his neighbors. He must take the neighbor that God sends him. And this is hard for me as an introvert. As somebody who's easily taxed by social engagement, I have to be very selective, I feel, with whom I engage, because if I engaged with everybody who would engage with me, then I would just be exhausted all the time. So this whole sermon has been particularly convicting. And while I've been reading it and prepping for this, I've been trying to behave more like I ought to and less like I have been. Because I'm not loving right if I'm loving a subset of humanity. And he says that if we keep working on loving this way, our love will eventually expand to encompass even those who are often considered unlovely. And he paints a beautiful portrait of that here. Thus will love spread, and spread in wider and stronger pulses, till the whole human race will be to the man sacredly lovely, drink debased, vice defeatured, pride puffed, wealth bollen, vanity smeared. They will yet be brothers, yet be sisters, yet be God-born neighbors. Any rough-hewn semblance of humanity will at length be enough to move the man to reverence and affection. And this description reminds me of the rather heartrending novel that MacDonald wrote called Sir Gibbie. Gibbie is actually mute and from an impoverished family. His father is a cobbler but also a drunkard, and so he squanders all his money on alcohol and kind of neglects Gibbie. But despite this, Gibbie has an extremely wholesome heart and loves his father dearly and takes care of his father while he's being drunk and abusive, and even wanders the streets and helps other people who are leaving the bars at the same time as his dad. When he gets his dad home safely from the bar, he'll go and help escort other drunk men back to their homes because he knows where they all live. And I think Gibby is a great illustration of the type of love that MacDonald's expressing here. Love despite people's vices, because we all have vices, and if we didn't love people who had them, then nobody would love anybody. And then he describes in a very lovely way what it can be like to finally realize these other people's humanity and be able to see through their eyes and be able to give them hope that they may not have access to at the time. He says, "Ah, brother, thou hast a soul like mine. Out of thine eyes thou lookest, and sights and sounds and odors visit thy soul as mine. With wonder and tender comforting, thou too lovest the faces of thy neighbors. Thou art oppressed with thy sorrows, uplifted with thy joys. Perhaps thou knowest not so well as I, that a region of gladness surrounds all thy grief, of light all thy darkness, of peace all thy tumult. O my brother, I will love thee. Thou art not me, thou art another life, a second life. Therefore I can, may, and will love thee." But I think my favorite line is that earlier part where he says, "Perhaps thou knowest not so well as I, that a region of gladness surrounds all thy grief, of light all thy darkness." And that just reminds me of the old woman in the cottage with the young eyes that you find in Fantastes. But I won't spoil that for anybody who hasn't read it. After taking a lovely look at what our love could be, MacDonald turns back and makes a rather convicting statement about what our love often is, in particular with reference to the afterlife and people's thoughts about heaven and hell. He says, "But he will no longer understand those who, so far from feeling the love of their neighbor an essential part of their being, expect to be set free from its law in the world to come." So he's been talking about how love should be expansive and all-encompassing, and then he's like, but some Christians might be holding out hope that maybe finally they'll be set free from that law when they go to heaven, because then they'll only have to love those who are in heaven. Oof, oof. "On its battlements of safety they will regard hell from afar, and say to each other, 'Hark, listen to their moans, but do not weep, for they are our neighbors no more.'" That just gives me goosebumps to hear. Then MacDonald says that St. Paul would be wretched before the throne of God if he thought that there was one man beyond the pale of his mercy, and that was as much for God's glory as for the man's sake. And I think I'm just going to read this whole section. And it's harkening back to that earlier sermon where MacDonald expressed his belief that God would redeem people even out of hell after they had been burned clean. He says, "Who that loves his brother would not, upheld by the love of Christ and with a dim hope that in a far-off time there might be some help for him, arise from the company of the blessed in heaven, and walk down into the dismal regions of despair, to sit with the last, the only unredeemed, the Judas of his race, and be himself more blessed in the pains of hell than in the glories of heaven? Who, in the midst of the golden harps and the white wings, knowing that one of his kind was howling unheeded far below in the vaults of the creation? Who, I say, would not feel that he must arise, that he had no choice, that, awful as it was, he must gird his loins and go down into the smoke and the darkness and the fire, traveling the weary and fearful road into the far country to find his brother? Who, I mean, that had the mind of Christ, that had the love of his Father?" Oof. Theological technicalities aside, it's hard to imagine that MacDonald's view on this does not sound like it should be true to God's heart. But MacDonald brings it back to our everyday life, saying that this type of expansive love is actually liberating and frees us from the worst of all dungeons, the dungeons of ourself. He says, "One more word. This love of our neighbor is the only door out of the dungeon of self, where we mope and mow, striking sparks and rubbing phosphorescences out of the walls, and blowing our own breath into our own nostrils, instead of issuing to the fair sunlight of God, the sweet winds of the universe." That's funny. Chesterton describes the materialistic worldview as a prison because there's nothing supernatural in it. And yet we're all rather eager to imprison ourselves in a smaller prison still, the material of ourself. He continues, "The man thinks his consciousness is himself,
whereas his life consisteth in the inbreathing of God and the consciousness of the universe of truth. To have himself, to know himself, to enjoy himself, he calls life. Whereas if he would forget himself, tenfold would be his life in God and his neighbors. The region of man's life is a spiritual region. God, his friends, his neighbors, his brothers all, is the wide world in which alone his spirit can find room. Himself is his dungeon. Of course, that's a Paradise Lost reference to Myself Am Hell again. And to conclude, MacDonald wraps us up and ties us to our next sermon as usual, saying, "But he may have begun to love his neighbor with the hope of ere long loving him as himself, and notwithstanding start back affrighted at yet another word of our Lord, seeming to be another law yet harder than the first, although in truth it is not another, for without obedience to it the former cannot be obtained unto. He has not yet learned to love his neighbor as himself, whose heart sinks within him at the word, I say unto you, love your enemies." And so we're going to take it up a notch and talk about loving your enemies next week. So I'll wrap it up there and go grade some papers, I guess.